Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm going to go my review of WCW Starrcade 1997. Starting off the evening, we'll go to our first match of the night. It is for the WCW Cruiserweight Championship. It is Eddie Guerrero versus Dean Malenko. I thought this was a great match. Back and forth matchup between Guerrero and Malenko, with Malenko keeping the pace of the match. Malenko then hits a power slam on Guerrero in the middle of the ring. Guerrero then gets up, hits a powerbomb on Malenko. Malenko then gets up, hits a powerbomb of his own on Guerrero, but Guerrero ultimately hits his signature frog splash off the top rope, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Eddie Guerrero. Hats off to Eddie Guerrero for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Scott Norton teaming up with Vincent and Randy Savage versus the Steiners and Big Bubba. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between both teams, with Norton, Vincent, and Randy Savage keeping the pace of the match. Norton hits a press slam on... Scott Steiner hits a press slam on Randy Savage. Then Rick Steiner hits a power slam on Norton, but Randy Savage ultimately hits an elbow drop off the top rope on Scott Steiner. Pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are Scott Norton, Vincent, and Randy Savage. Hats off to Scott Norton, Vincent, and Randy Savage for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Goldberg versus Steve McMichael. I believe this was Goldberg's first ever pay-per-view debut for WCW. The match itself, it was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Goldberg and McMichael, with Goldberg keeping the pace of the match. And Goldberg ultimately hits his signature jackhammer on McMichael, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Goldberg. Hats off to Goldberg for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is a Ravens Rules match. It is Saturn versus Chris Benoit. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Saturn and Benoit. The Flock end up attacking Benoit. Saturn then was keeping the pace of the match, but Benoit applies a crossface on the outside of the ring. The Flock end up attacking Benoit on the outside. Benoit then gets in the ring, hits a diving headbutt off the top rope on Saturn. Raven then gets involved in the match, hits a DDT on Benoit. Saturn then capitalizes on this, goes for the cover, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Saturn. Hats off to Saturn for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Lex Luger versus Buff Bagwell. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Lex and Bagwell, with Lex keeping the pace of the match. Lex then hits a press slam on Bagwell. Bagwell then hits a running knee, takes out the referee. Lex then applies a torture rack on Bagwell. Randy Savage makes his way down to the ring, attacks Lex Luger. Lex then gets up, applies a torture rack on Randy Savage. Scott Norton makes his way down to the ring as well and attacks Lex Luger. And then Bagwell goes for the cover, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Buff Bagwell. Hats off to Buff Bagwell for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW United States Championship. It is DDP versus Curt Hennig. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between DDP and Hennig, with DDP keeping the pace of the match. And DDP ultimately hits his signature diamond cutter on Curt Hennig, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match, and at that time new WCW United States Champion, is Diamond Dallas Page. Hats off to Diamond Dallas Page for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Larry Zbyszko versus Eric Bischoff, with special guest referee Bret Hart. I thought this was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between Zbyszko and Bischoff, with Zbyszko keeping the pace of the match. Hall then puts a weapon into Eric's boot. Eric then hits Zbyszko with the boot. Bret Hart then attacks Eric Bischoff. Hart then attacks Scott Hall, who was ringside. And your winner of the match is Zbyszko. Hats off to Larry Zbyszko for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the main event of Starrcade 1997. It is Hollywood Hogan versus Sting for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Hogan and Sting, with Hogan keeping the pace of the match. Hogan then lands a big boot on Sting as well as a leg drop. Pins for the 3. And your winner of the match is Hollywood Hogan. After the match, Hart makes his way down to the ring. He ends up attacking the referee. The match continues. Sting then hits a Stinger Splash on Hogan. NWO make their way out to the ring, but Sting applies a Scorpion Deathlock on Hollywood Hogan. And your winner of the match, and at that time new WCW World Heavyweight Champion, is Sting. Hats off to Sting for getting the win in that matchup. Couple of things I'm going to say about Starrcade 1997, man. Number one, it was a solid event from top to bottom. The opening matchup, Guerrero versus Malenko for the Cruiserweight Championship. I mentioned this multiple times in the past, man, and I'm going to reiterate this. The Cruiserweight division for WCW was severely underrated. This was a great match between Guerrero and Malenko, but Guerrero, got the victory over Malenko in this matchup to retain the Cruiserweight Championship. But honestly, for what it's worth, that match could have main evented any card at that time, in my honest opinion. The Cruiserweight division was severely underrated for WCW. Goldberg versus Steve McMichael. The one interesting thing I'll say about this matchup was that, like I stated earlier, this was Goldberg's first ever pay-per-view match for WCW. Obviously, the storyline that he had when he came over to WCW in the beginning was, a storyline between Goldberg and McMichael. But it was a solid matchup. I mean, you're not going to get a whole lot out of Goldberg, to be honest with you. I mean, the jackhammer, the spear. But Goldberg, went on to have a hell of a career in WCW. And this was a great match. It was a solid match between Goldberg and McMichael. Saturn versus Benoit in a Ravens Rules match. I really personally wasn't a big fan of the Ravens Rules match. I do think Raven is severely underrated as well as being a professional wrestler and a great mind for the business. I think some of the promos that Raven cut back in the day were awesome, especially the Flock. Having guys like Riggs and Van Hammer and Kidman and Reese a part of that, the Flock. I think the Flock was also an underrated stable in WCW, and they really could have done a lot more with the Flock in WCW, in my honest opinion. But the match itself between Saturn and Benoit, it was a solid matchup, but like I said, I'm not a big fan of the Ravens Rules match. Lex Luger versus Bagwell, it was a solid match. I was kind of hoping that Lex would get the win, but unfortunately he did not, and Bagwell was victorious. And then obviously we have DDP versus Kurt Hennig for the United States Championship. That was also a really good matchup, and it was actually DDP's first championship win in WCW at that time, so it was a big deal for DDP. The crowd erupted when he won the title over Hennig, so it was a solid matchup. Larry Zbyszko versus Eric Bischoff. It was an okay matchup. I think seeing Bret Hart as a special guest referee made the match a little bit more better. Obviously, Bret Hart getting involved and attacking Eric Bischoff and Scott Hall was awesome to see as well. But the match itself between Zbyszko and Bischoff, it was an okay match at best. And then the main event. To me, Starrcade 97 was all about the main event. It was Hogan versus Sting. And this was a time where, obviously Sting took a year off and, reinvented himself into the Crow Sting that we all know now. And, it took a whole year for Sting to get to this point at Starrcade 97. And the only thing that you really saw from Sting leading up to Starrcade 1997 when he, had his first official match, his first match under the Crow Sting was, vignettes that were being played. You would see Sting in the rafters kind of tormenting the NWO, especially Hollywood Hogan. So you didn't really see much of Sting as far as, a match is concerned until Starrcade 1997. So that storyline that WCW was building with Sting was one of the best storylines I think WCW put together, because, that was a year-long storyline that continuously kept developing into something better and better and better until we get the final product of Hogan versus Sting in the main event of Starrcade. But I will say, with that being said, there was some flaws with this match. I think it was one of the biggest, I wouldn't say botches, but letdowns initially when Hogan pinned Sting. I don't know what was the idea of that, because it didn't take Hogan long to hit the big boot and drop the leg, the leg drop on Sting and pin for the 1-2-3. So it was kind of like a botched finish, because technically Hogan did win and the referee was knocked out, and then Bret Hart comes down Sting locks in the Scorpion Deathlock, and Bret Hart gives him the win. But it was a huge moment for Sting. Obviously taking that sabbatical for a year and the storyline leading up to this match. But the smart choice would have been putting the championship on Sting. You know what I mean? Sting came back from a long year off. Everybody loves Sting, so it was great to see Sting come back and beat Hogan for the World Heavyweight Championship. But with that being said, just like I do with every single one of these pay-per-views, I always give these pay-per-views a rating from 1 out of 10. 1 being the absolute worst, 10 being the absolute best. With all the matches on this card, man, it was really kind of hard to figure out where I was going to give this, pay-per-view a rating from 1 out of 10. I think Starrcade 1997, man, I'm going to give it a solid rating of a 6.5 at best. And the main reason why, is Guerrero versus Malenko, DDP versus Hennig, and obviously the main event between Hollywood Hogan and Sting is the reason why I'm giving Starrcade 1997 a solid rating of a 6.5 at best, because those were the 3 best matches on this card. But with that being said, this is my review of WCW Starrcade 1997. I hope you guys are out there staying safe, be careful, and remember, stay classic. Peace.